You ever get the feeling that one of the writers didn't have to do their research for an episode? You ever get the feeling that this episode practically wrote itself? If we debuted our first analysis episode earlier, like back in the beginning of Season 4, we would have been able to release a video about Pinky Apple Pie and could now draw correlations within Natasha Levenger's 2 episodes. As it currently stands, I'm a little sad that we didn't start the series sooner because that particular episode gave me the same feeling as this one. Experience and empathy. The understanding of the Breezies' predicament. I thought Pinky Apple Pie was a fluke. I'll condense my feelings for it and save them for when we actually catch up on analyzing all the episodes, but to make a long story short, I couldn't believe how that episode played out. I had a feeling that Levenger was going to be an excellent writer not only for this series, but for what I want within the show, and this episode has only further strengthened those feelings. I'll explain later.
It Ain't Easy Being Breezies was definitely an episode that could have gone horribly wrong. Using characters of correlations to past generations of My Little Pony, throwing the episode in the hands of a writer that only had 1 episode under their belt, and last but not least, having an episode around Fluttershy, a character that has been, for lack of a better word, sometimes inconsistent in character portrayal ever since Putting Your Hoof Down. A good example was Fluttershy during Magic Duel and her fear over meeting Twilight at Sakura's hut. M.A. Larson admitted at one of the convention writing panels that since he treats the show like a sitcom, he usually uses Fluttershy's fear as the butt of a joke despite her growing and putting her hoof down, and he's taken a little bit of criticism for that.
But what did we get instead? Well, let's dive in and see. Unfortunately, the first scene of the episode is probably the weakest to me, as Fluttershy pep talks her friends into trying to practice a soft cheer in order to welcome the Breezies without startling them. This entire scene is completely understandable, since Fluttershy knows that the Breezies are very soft and fragile creatures. Because of this, everything needs to be smaller or softer in order to keep the Breezies comfortable enough to go home.
Now, the problem that we have with this scene is essentially subjective, which is why we aren't really going to drag on it too much. Basically, Viking and I feel at least that the cheer was a little tacked on to the beginning of the scene, because the scene would have been a little awkward if there wasn't a little something extra than just Fluttershy explaining that the Breezes were coming to their town. As the writers have said at panels, the format of every script is, and we're paraphrasing here, opener, act 1, act 2, and act 3, with a foreboding cliffhanger that happens at the end of the opener in each act, what we know as commercial breaks. So to put it in these terms, the opener would have felt significantly shorter if the cheer wasn't in it, and while the cheer may be an awesome callback in reversal of Sonic Rainboom's opening, your mileage may vary on whether or not it feels out of place.
But as we previously said, the cheer indeed correlates to the later acts since the entire town is silent during the Breezy migration. Even Pinkie Pie is quiet during their migration due to a hilarious amount of effort, and a viewpoint could argue that not only would Pinkie not have been quiet if Fluttershy didn't organize their private cheering session, but Fluttershy was basically killing 2 birds with 1 stone by not only making sure that Pinkie wouldn't startle the Breezies, since a hyperactive mare like her would definitely need to calm down, but also explain this to the rest of her friends. Since Twilight was the one to introduce the Breezies, it could be said that the previous scene was important because Twilight probably spread Fluttershy's information that Ponyville needed to be quiet for the migration during the off time between the cheering and the migration.
Because of that, the crowd was perfectly quiet instead of the usual social stigma that comes with cheering on a team. Or perhaps the few that didn't know about the Breezies were now informed because of Fluttershy's information. Either way, the opening scene definitely had its place, and while we don't want to say it was pulled from nowhere, we would say that the entire being silent bit that took up much of the opener could have been a simple reminder in Act 1 by Twilight for the crowd to quiet down from the migration. A simple, quiet down every pony, here come the Breezies.
But we're dwelling a little too long on this. Back in Act 1, we see Flitter and that other Pegasi creating the breeze up in the sky while Fluttershy explains the magic and lore behind the Breezies. I feel that the explanation dragged on a little more than it had to be, and it's a little odd when you go from a simplistic explanation such as no breeze means no magic means the pollen is bad, and then they use divert in the same minute considering the target demographic.
And then once Freddie Mercury comes onto the scene, this is when Fluttershy's overprotection of the Breezies begins to show, but in an understandable way. Rarity's sparkling clothes were definitely too bright, and because of that, she had to get rid of them so that the Breezies wouldn't crash. That's understandable and logical. It's when we get later into the episode where her coddling goes too far, but we'll get to that later.
Soon enough, we're introduced to the Breezies, and the main one of this episode, Seabreeze, an outspoken and significantly rude Breezy as shown by his small, yet unknown outburst and frown. However, something else happens in this episode that I feel really needs to be pointed out.
Spike accidentally disrupts a group of Breezies with a leaf due to his overexcitement and the group begins to fall behind. This was an excellent point to cut to commercial, even if pretty much the entire audience would correctly guess that nothing bad was going to happen to the Breezies. Even without the Zaptua explanation or spoilers, it wasn't like the Breezies were going to be injured too terribly, although that was definitely a possible hypothesis considering some of the spoiler explanations. So while the drama wasn't there, I'd say due to the time constraints of the episode, it was a good place for a commercial.
As the Breezies are beginning to scatter, we see Seabreeze yell something indistinguishable to the group, but it obviously doesn't help since Fluttershy has to step in. Again, Seabreeze's facial expressions are a good tip as to what kind of character he is, even if both of his lines were a different language, although admittedly, I didn't really catch the nods towards what he was in this scene the first time around, so maybe it was the same with others.
Fluttershy saves all the Breezies and Seabreeze insults the group again, which provides the riff for the Breezies that is basically rode throughout the episode. The main six come in to congratulate Fluttershy for her bravado up until a certain point.
Okay. I know what you're all thinking. Why don't you just say it? I'm sorry. This is all my fault. I'm so sorry.
This was the first moment in the episode where I was impressed. Not only was there already an obvious callback to Sonic Rainboom in the cheering scene, but the possible fear that inhabits Spike's everyday life bled through completely in this little breakdown. Back in the Crystal Empire Part 2, the Mirror of Hate's projection on Spike showed that his greatest fear was not being wanted by Twilight anymore. Along with this, due to the fact that he is currently a child, messing up something as big as a Breezy migration would cause Spike to be this scared about the consequences, especially if he happened to upset one of Twilight's friends.
Spike's words of "I know what you're all thinking" and "just say it" really puts an interesting scope on how Spike thinks the main six view him. While it may have seemed the Power Ponies episode put to bed the idea that Spike thinks the main six consider him a sidekick, what Viking and I find so amazing about this scene is that Natasha points this out and gives us a nice healthy dose of realism.
While television shows and animes in the lot, especially with MLP, tend to portray the idea that these lessons are all immediately absorbed by the characters once they learn them, perhaps it's just me, but sometimes that simply just isn't the case. Imagine if you were in Spike's position. You're a child servant that is taken care of and friends with some pony who is not only vastly more important than you, but has more friends, more responsibilities, and seems to do more things right than you. Episodes that completely embarrass Spike for in and out of character reasons such as Spike at your service, despite their faults, are canon, and I feel that Natasha is saying something for all of the Spike fans out there.
The simple fact is that she gets it. She gets that Spike has been pinned as the butt monkey of this series for a significant amount of time now, and while he's done some things right, such as save the Crystal Empire and the main six and Power Ponies, if Spike is terrified enough over what he did to run to the main six, crying and accepting of whatever punishment was going to happen to him, then Spike hasn't exactly been growing up in the healthiest of mindsets.
It's quite possible that if the show wasn't catered to children and Spike was able to be thrown into a therapist chair, you could see the first etchings of an inferiority complex to ponies within his mind, possibly depression as well. He's a child that is constantly having his goals either held farther away from him or undermined along with his accomplishments because bad stuff keeps happening to him or because of him, intentional or otherwise. While some shows make this the point of their character and continuously play it off for laughs, like MLP sometimes does, Levenger points out that this is not how Spike should be, and that's not how I believe Spike should be treated either, and not just because of my pet peeve with children when it comes to media, but that's personal, so I'll save that for a separate conversation.
Fluttershy ameliorates Spike's concerns with a perfect choice of words if he did have such an inferiority complex, by saying that it could have happened to any of them, and Spike becomes happier for the time being and steps away. Now, remember our previous video in which we said that some of the dialogue felt awkward in bats because of Spike's random lines such as,
Don't mention it, Applejack. It was my pleasure. Really.
We felt this way because, at least to us, the scene felt like Spike was saying something weird just because it was something. It was a line, so that the writer could get the quota of Spike's lines out of the way and not make it feel awkward that he didn't say much in such a large time frame. Despite both the ensemble cast being there and Applejack pointing him out with her "I want all hooves and claws on deck" line.
In Breezies, Spike doesn't do much for the rest of the episode because he is trying to be under the radar and is cautious about his screw-up, as evidenced by his line.
I'm just gonna stay over here.
Again, we feel that this was a perfect choice for the ensemble cast and Spike in their scenes. Spike's presence in Breezies is still the same insofar as he practically did his duty and was done for the episode, but he wasn't completely awkward and didn't feel shoved into the script. Along with our previous point about Spike's mental condition, we feel that in this minute or so, there was just so much that you could see from Levenger's writing choices. If I had a hat, Levenger, I'd tip it off to you, but I'm not allowed to wear one. Court order.
Anyway, Fluttershy offers to take the Breezies to her home to make them feel better before they go back, and we get the shot of Seabreeze looking concerned and sad. Soon enough, Fluttershy is giving amenities to the Breezies to make them feel better, and her amenities begin to be less of what they need and more of what they want. Of course, it's subjective over which amenities are more important to have than the others, but it's fair to say that water and a blanket that's literally just a tissue, which Fluttershy probably has hundreds of, is more important than a hoof-knitted sweater, which could possibly take a long time to sew even with Fluttershy's expertise.
Then Twilight and Applejack show up, and the true problem of the episode comes to light. Fluttershy is hesitant to let the Breezies go into the real world, and Twilight brings up that the real world is not where they're going. They're merely going to use Equestria to get to the Breezy world. Fluttershy agrees, but stalls the Breezies since the group doesn't want to leave due to a combination of Seabreeze being a dick and Fluttershy's coddling. Twilight and Applejack decide to trust Fluttershy and leave her be, while Fluttershy speaks to Seabreeze.
Seabreeze's impatience begins to set in as he once again badmouths the group, wanting to get home and plaguing their reliance on the Pegasus Breeze. Fluttershy tries to play peacemaker between Seabreeze and the group, and her conversation with Seabreeze flows well up until the snack. More coddling happens before Seabreeze's true frustrations begin to sink in. While Seabreeze was definitely being a dick, his badmouthing was understandable considering his predicament and eventually what was at home waiting for him.
Another adept move by Levenger, in my opinion. The episode moves from Seabreeze being sort of a dickish antagonist to an understandable one. Nearly every viewer, both Brony and Child, can sympathize with wanting to be somewhere despite real life or even people getting in the way. While for children it may have been minutely harder to sympathize with a yelling meanie until now, the breaking of Seabreeze's resolve and composure definitely helps turn the tide on the viewer's empathy. The Breezies are in a world that is not their own, and Seabreeze just wants to go home. Seabreeze's yelling wasn't based on hatred or anger towards the group, but fear and frustration over what he can't have because of life, a problem that is very easy to sympathize with.
Soon enough, the Breezies play hooky and end up in a party while the Pegasi asks for more time. Funny that the Breezies were able to party when they were supposedly sick. Apparently, Fluttershy has the same mentality for the Breezies as any parent does for their supposedly sick child. We get a neat little glimpse into the look of the Breezy culture with their music choice and saxophone on top of their accent, although Vicodin and I can't really figure out what exactly their culture is.
Seabreeze interrupts the party and finally gets Fluttershy to agree to letting the Breezies go, but not before Seabreeze escapes for the commercial break. Seabreeze tries to ride the regular wind back home, only to end up with a hive of bees that would have most certainly killed him. And wait a minute, was that Mr. Krabs' walking sound effect?
It totally was. Anyway, Fluttershy is in a cute bee outfit, and her assertiveness comes through as she gets some bees to back off. As Seabreeze thanks Fluttershy, what could be construed as the second moral of the episode begins to show, as Fluttershy learns about her overprotectiveness and Seabreeze learns about his dickishness. Fluttershy's redacted spoiler thingy shows up, and she takes Seabreeze back to her home to explain to the Breezies that they need to go home. They leave and, oh no, not the fields. Please not the fields.
Out of nowhere, man. It's like, what's the opposite of an M. Night Shyamalan plot twist? You know, a good one?
Yeah, he sucks at plot twists, we know.
In the next scene, the Pegasi are having trouble putting the wind at Goldilocks speed, and Twilight ends up changing the main 6 into Breezies to help lead them on their journey. For the sake of pacing in the video, I'm just going to assume that 6 additional Breezies is actually a huge difference when it comes to the wind, and not go any further even though the beginning of the migration had like hundreds of Breezies. And then we...
Pinky, you're making it really hard for my mind not to wander. Soon enough, the main 6 help lead the Breezies home, and we see Seabreeze's adorable lover and child. Fluttershy and the Breezies share a heartfelt moment before she leaves of her new redacted spoilerly key thingy. The main 6 are turned back into ponies, and Rainbow is denied the ability to have claws. End of episode.
Shall we slip into our comfy chair, Alex?
Let's. But before we do, let's add one more thing. We kind of wanted to gloss over this since it would be the most obvious thing to point out in this episode for analysts, but we'll go over it anyway. Levenger brings up the hot button topic on animals in captivity within this episode, which is something that Vicodin and I wanted to see portrayed within a Fluttershy episode for some time now. What we can get from this episode is the classic saying of, "You can have too much of good things" certainly applies. Much like an endangered panda that's been raised in a zoo and having everything given to them, Fluttershy was doing the same to the Breezies, but the captivity metaphor is made even more dangerous due to the time constraints of the Breezies portal, and the fact that pretty much no amount of coddling on Fluttershy's part would have been able to make the Breezies safe from Equestria, the world of Hydras, Changelings, Discord, and Pinkie Pie's battering of the fourth wall to the point that it probably warrants a restraining order by now.
The interesting part about this episode is that it wasn't exactly heart-pounding. The commercial breaks were exactly what they were, instead of dramatic cliffhangers like most episodes of the show, and even if the episode seemed to be dramatic, such as the cliffhanger right after Act 2, you knew that nothing bad was going to happen, and it wasn't intentional because the previous cliffhangers had the same effect. But what was amazing about this episode was the sheer realism. Spike's scene, Seabreeze's impatience combined with Fluttershy's problem, and the combined two morals are all perfect choices to keep the episode on track, real, and avoiding the contrivances and usual use of the idiot ball that spurs the plot forward in some episodes. What do you think, Alex?
If anything, this has been the most entertaining episode of the season thus far. Good writing and morals aside, the episode was just plain fun to watch. There were a lot of great lines and visual gags, to the point I could spend a whole review just talking about those, and despite its relative calmness, the episode never really had a dull moment. Sure, the Breezy transformation at the end was a bit strange and unexpected, but it was really cool to see Twilight being able to pull off that kind of complex magic without breaking a sweat. I'm not really sure if they needed that per se, but it didn't do any harm, well, except to my ears when Pinky spoke. Cap all that off with a satisfying ending and you've got yourself a good episode.
Also, and we're pretty much throwing this in post-production, but apparently Vegeta voiced Seabreeze. Wow, there's your fun fact of the day. Well, that just about covers this episode of In Retrospect. Make sure to subscribe if you already haven't, and we'll start working on catching up to the other episodes during any possible downtime. We're looking at doing Season 4 before any other episodes, but if you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments.
Along with that, we decided to start opening ourselves up to questions and possible topic choices for future videos. If you have a question for us or a suggestion for a video later on down the line, definitely leave it in the comments, we'll be sure to take a look. Now with that said, I think we're about done here, so have a good day and pony on.